Tech force came to the rescue, and now we are very. We can move to Professor Chomsky. Please welcome Professor Chomsky.
How's this? Can you hear in the back? Well, one of the things you learn if you're at MIT, as long as I've been, about 60 years, is that there are technology has some easy problems and some hard problems. There are easy problems like developing computers, creating the internet, onto nanotechnology, robotics that enables us will soon allow us to have fly-sized drones on the ceiling carrying out surveillance in our living rooms. And then there are hard problems like getting a sound system to work. They never figured it out. Anyone who's been to an MIT commencement knows that there's almost a guarantee that the sound system will collapse. Well, I'm not a specialist on Turkey. I won't talk much about Turkish history. In the last 15 years, I've visited Turkey repeatedly and have gotten a kind of a snapshot view of quite interesting and significant changes that have been taking place. My first visit was about 15 years ago, was at the end near the end of a very dark period in Turkish history. There had been a huge state terror operation through the 1990s aimed at the Kurdish population in southeastern Turkey. Tens of thousands of people were killed, several thousand towns and villages were destroyed, every kind of torture that you can imagine. There were hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of refugees driven to Western Turkey or beyond. I visited slums in Istanbul, which people in Istanbul don't know about, in areas where there are condemned buildings that are in fact inhabited by the Kurdish refugees from the east, families living in a family living in a small room where nobody, the father, mother, young child cannot leave the room. It's too dangerous outside. There were in some of these places teenage children who did go out to earn some money. I hate to think what they were doing, but they could more or less survive. I was told by the people there that they could go back to their destroyed villages and reconstruct them. They were allowed to do that, but only on one condition, that they signed statements saying that the villages had been destroyed by the Kurdish guerrillas, PKK, which of course wasn't true. They were destroyed by the Turkish army, and refusing to sign these statements, they were consigned to the slums, where worse than slums, where they'll presumably be there forever. I went on a couple of times to Diyarbakir, the kind of semi-official capital of Turkey in the southeast. There were people living in the city surrounded by walls, people living in caves in the walls. We were followed by a lot of security and Turkish security, also television. And my guides, one of them, the head of Human Rights Watch in Turkey, if they noticed down a street that there were children playing whose clothes, the combination of their clothes matched the Kurdish flag, they would steer us in another direction because the parents could suffer for allowing children's clothes that might suggest the Kurdish flag. And I did give a talk in Diyarbakir the first time I was there, town hall, and at the end of the talk, something very dramatic happened. There was a discussion, and a couple of young men came up carrying a book. It was a Kurdish English dictionary, which was banned in Turkey, so it was illegal. It had been smuggled in from France and had an inscription in the front, which, moving inscription, the book's in my office if anyone wants to see it, just expressing their wish that someday they would be able to use their own language. This is a very courageous act in front of Turkish security and television. I tried to find out later what happened to them. A couple of weeks later, they were arrested and disappeared after that. I haven't been able to trace it further. My first visit was to take part supposedly to observe a trial. It was a trial of a publisher who had translated published translation of a book of mine. The book had about 10 pages or so on Turkey, covering the atrocities of the preceding decade, the 1990s. So he was under, the publisher and its owner were tried. The trials are before a military court, which has no resemblance to a court. His lawyer, Osman Baydemir, later the mayor of Diyarbakir, more recently arrested in the recent wave of arrests, his lawyer suggested that I should insist on being a co-defendant in the trial. He assumed, turned out correctly, that if I did, the government would call off the trial because they didn't want the publicity. There was a lot of international press around for that event. So I did, and sure enough, the next day we walked into the courtroom and the prosecutor informed the judge that they were dropping the charges, and the trial ended. A very temporary victory, because a couple of months later he was arrested and tried again, and hard to find out what happened to him. On the way out, I learned something interesting about the International Press Corps. There was a lot of international press there, including some American journalists. They were there for the spectacle. And when the trial was called off, they all walked out. As we were walking out, the police were bringing in a young woman. I stopped to talk to her. It turned out she's a journalist who was being tried before the same court. If the press had been willing to stay there for another 20 minutes, she probably would have been released. Because again, for the same reason, they don't want the publicity. But not a single journalist was willing to spend 20 minutes to save a young colleague from being sent to a Turkish prison, which is not very pleasant, with whatever followed. Well, these were some of the worst atrocities of the 1990s, and the U.S. was involved up to its neck. 80% of Turkey's arms that were used for the atrocities were coming from the United States, Clinton administration. The atrocities peaked in 1997. In 1997, Clinton sent the level of arms sent to Turkey in 1997 was about the same as the total shipment of arms to Turkey in the entire Cold War period up to the onset of the counterinsurgency, the state terror. All of this is unknown here. There were, of course, news bureaus in Turkey and Ankara, but they wouldn't report it. Actually, one of the very few people to have written about it, to write about it at the time, was John Terman, who's now head of the Center for International Studies here. It was unknown for two reasons. First of all, it's typical that the press does not want to report and academics do not want to discuss our own crimes. It's much nicer to talk about other people's crimes. Also, this was enhanced here because there was a preferred story. The 1990s were right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the story was that now the United States is free to demonstrate its profound commitment to principles and values, to act on the basis of altruism alone, to lead the enlightened states as they can now they're free to disregard international law and the Security Council and carry out their marvelous missions. Led by the New World, bent on a crusade to end inhumanity. Clinton's foreign policy was described as having a saintly glow as it entered into a noble phase. These are all quotes from leading international left liberal, mostly intellectuals. That was the preferred story. And it's not nice to disturb the preferred story with a dose of reality, of which the crucial, decisive U.S. participation in Turkish atrocities is one and only one example. In fact, all of this episode is so embarrassing that it's been erased from history. Can't find any reference to it. Well, in the early years of this millennium, there were improvements. As you visited year by year, you could see detectable improvements in the human rights condition. The attacks on the Kurds declined, the circumstances improved, Diyarbakir was much more open. As I say, Osman Baydemir was elected mayor. That continued until about 2005. At that point, there was a very clear shift. Most analysts in Turkey attribute that, I think plausibly, to the fact that in 2005, the European Union made it pretty clear that no matter what improvements there were in Turkish human rights behavior, the EU was not going to admit Turkey as a member, as the pretext for not allowing them was human rights violations, of which members of the European Union are not immune to charges about that, but Turkey didn't reach their high standards. As the standards improved, the bar went higher. And it was pretty clear that the real reason was just plain European racism. The Europeans don't want Turks walking around the streets. That became quite obvious in Germany in particular. There was a government minister, Thilo Sarrazin, published a book which quickly became a bestseller in Germany, protesting that the Turks were not becoming Germans. They weren't they were still keeping their own culture and staying together. Angela Merkel, the chancellor, chimed in and, of course, condemned the book. Everyone had to condemn the book. But she said it was true. Multiculturalism had failed. Turks were not, to put it metaphorically, becoming blonde and blue-eyed. And therefore, it was a real problem. Those with a sense of irony might bear in mind that Benjamin Franklin, the leading Enlightenment figure in the early days of the United States, argued that Germans should not be allowed to immigrate to the United States because they're too swarthy. Swedes, too, they're too swarthy to immigrate. But today it's Turks who can't be accepted in Europe, so Turkey was not going to be admitted no matter what. And the Turkish policy changed notably at that time, possibly for that reason. It became there was a return to a serious repression, up to the events that you've recently been hearing about. U.S. attitudes towards Turkey also changed. During the period of the huge atrocities in the 90s, there was virtually no coverage. But after 2003, there was a beginning of retrospective coverage of Turkish atrocities, always, of course, excising the U.S. role. That's unmentionable. So what was the reason? Well, there was a reason. Turkey committed a major crime in 2003, for which was unforgivable. The Turkish government, to everyone's surprise, followed the will of 90%, 95% of the population and refused to participate in the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That's a real crime. Killing tens of thousands of people and so on, we don't care about that. But following the will of the overwhelming majority of the population is a major crime. And Turkey was bitterly condemned for that. sanctions were suggested. Paul Wolfowitz, government official who was known here as, he was called the idealist in chief, leading the alleged democracy movement of the Bush administration. He went so far as to personally condemn the Turkish military because they didn't overthrow the government and force it to carry out their duty of following the United States in invading Iraq on the pretext that 95% of the population disagreed. So at that point, it did become possible to start describing some of the atrocities of the 90s, of course, excising the U.S. role. And then as repression increased in Turkey, U.S. relations with the government also improved. That's pretty normal and characteristic. And the repression became pretty severe, as you've heard. As you just heard, Turkey now has the highest per capita imprisonment for terror by quite a long shot. The organization Reporters Without Borders published an annual report of repression of journalists around the world. Last year they published it, and they also published a special supplement specifically about Turkey. It was entitled "Turkey, World's Biggest Prison for Journalists." The report was based on an intensive study. It concluded, I'll quote, that the number of detained journalists is unprecedented since the end of military rule, mostly representatives of the Kurdish media. That was one aspect of rising repression. Altogether, there were mass arrests of political activists, particularly Kurds, including mayors, former parliamentarians, and so on. The U.S., as usual, is participating. It's no secret to anyone, or it shouldn't be, that the Obama administration has gone out of its way to lead a major attack on civil liberties in the United States. And one of the most extreme cases, which is not as well known as it should be, involves Turkey. It's a Justice Department case brought by, it's called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. It's a case brought by the Obama administration against the Humanitarian Law Project. That's a legal aid association, which was committing the crime of providing legal advice to a Turkish organization that's on the U.S. terrorist list. That's too much for the Obama administration. You read the court case, it could pretty well condemn as a terrorist anyone in the U.S. who, say, advises a group on the terrorist list to turn to nonviolent actions or just investigates them out of an interest in research. I've done that. Others might. We might incidentally ask ourselves, that's a very sharp attack on freedom of speech and civil rights. We might ask ourselves, just what is the terrorist list? As you heard, the Turkish version of what's a terrorist is leading to a huge wave of imprisonment. The U.S. terrorist list is also an interesting phenomenon. It's assumed here to be legitimate. The government can put anyone it likes on the terrorist list without judicial review, without argument, take anyone off that it likes. It should be regarded as a scandal, particularly when you look at how it's used. So, for example, Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist list until about 4 years ago. If he wanted to come to the United States, he had to have special dispensation. Now, the reason is that the Reagan administration, toward the very end of the apartheid years, condemned the African National Congress, Mandela's African National Congress, as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was Reagan's justification for providing aid and assistance to apartheid South Africa to defend themselves from the terror of the ANC. On the other hand, take Saddam Hussein. He was removed from the terrorist list in 1982 by the Reagan administration because they wanted to provide substantial aid to Saddam in his invasion of Iran, so therefore he had to be removed from the terrorist list. That left a gap in the terrorist list, so they had to put someone in. And what they did was put Cuba in. That was in honor of the fact that Cuba is the target of more international terrorism than all states in the world combined, coming from the United States. And in fact, there had just been a huge upsurge in terrorism against Cuba, so they were put on the terrorist list as Saddam Hussein was removed, and Mandela was put on a couple of years later. It was just recently taken off. That's the terrorist list. The fact that we pay attention to it here is pretty amazing. Well, then comes Taksim Square, Gezi Park. Heard about that. Meanwhile, I should say that throughout this whole period, there have been enormous changes among the Turkish public. It's pretty remarkable to see. I won't go through the details, but I was just there a couple of months ago, most recently, and right before the Taksim Square events. I was there as to give a lecture, in a memorial lecture for Hrant Dink. Hrant Dink is the journalist who began to expose the truth about the atrocities against the Armenians, which had been hidden and denied and so on. He was assassinated almost surely by government agents. There was some story concocted which nobody believed. This was a memorial lecture, huge turnout, big march through Istanbul, ended with a huge demonstration in front of the building where Hrant Dink worked and where he was assassinated, with signs, we are all Hrant Dink. And meanwhile, there has been a considerable exposure of the crimes committed against the Armenians, horrible crimes, a century earlier, for the first time, and also actions taken. So when I was in Diyarbakir 10 years ago, what I was interested in. Diyarbakir is one of the places where the massacres were really peaked. It was horrible massacres there. So I asked if there was any remnant of the Armenian community, and I was taken to a church, or the ruins of a church. Virtually nothing left. The roof gone, a couple of pillars, and that was the main Armenian church. I asked if anyone had collected anything from the church before it was destroyed, and they told me that took me to a storefront nearby. It was an Armenian man in his 80s, who had collected artifacts from the church. That's what was left of the Armenian community. Last time I was there, early this year, I discovered that activists in Turkey had that have a foundation which had rebuilt the church, rebuilt the Armenian church, was trying to reconstruct the truth about what happened, and also the remnants of the Armenian community. These are very significant developments. When you took a look at knowing anything about this, the enormous protests at Taksim Square were not that much of a surprise. Very brave, very courageous, brutally repressed, as you heard, but not a surprise. Another element of this is, that we should bear in mind, is a very striking fact about Turkey is it's the only country I know where with leading intellectuals, leading writers, artists, journalists, academics, publishers, have constantly been protesting the atrocities and the crimes, and not only protesting but engaged in active resistance against them, facing imprisonment, sometimes enduring it. That's not a lot of fun, but they keep going, no matter how bad the impression was. I don't know of any other country like that. It's very impressive and a lesson. And in fact, all of this, I think, teaches us a lot, Americans here, that we can learn about our own record, what it's actually like, what we've been doing in the world, and also what can be done to change it. under much harsher conditions than we endure.